morning, I am Madhurima Datta, a zoology and biology educational content creator. Now's content for B.Sc and M.Sc in zoology honors, microbiology honors, physiology honors, botany honors, and also biotechnology honors. Paper Animal Behavior, Unit 2, Learning Behavior, and today I will discuss about the conditioning learning. And this is also exams for CUT PG exam, GATE exam, DBT exam, IIT JAM exam, BARC exam, and CSI NET Life Sciences exam. Conditioning learning behavior in animals. Conditioned learning is a form of associative learning in which an animal establishes a predictive relationship between two stimuli or between its own voluntary behavior and an environmental outcome. Unlike innate behaviors, and conditioning allows organisms to modify their behavioral response based on individual experience, enhancing adaptive survival in variable environments. First is classical conditioning, that is type 1 or Pavlovian conditioning. Discovered by Leon Pavlov in 1904, classical conditioning occurs when a biologically neutral stimulus becomes associated with a biologically significant unconditioned stimulus, eventually eliciting an involuntary reflex responses. Next, unconditioned stimulus. A stimulus that naturally and automatically trigger a responses without prior training. Example, food. Next, unconditioned response. That is, the unlearned natural physiological response to the unconditioned stimulus is called unconditioned response. That is salivation. Next, conditioned stimulus. A previously neutral stimulus, example bell or metronome tone, that after repeated association with the unconditional stimulus comes to trigger a conditioned response. And what is the conditioned response? The learned response to the previously neutral conditioned stimulus is called conditioned response. That is salivation upon hearing the bell alone. Important features and neural phenomena of the conditioning learning. First is acquisition. The repeated paired presentation of, that is conditioned stimulation plus unconditioned stimulation equals to CS2, that is conditioned stimulation 2, that is association. Next, extinction. Weakening and eventual disappearance of the conditioning stimulus and conditioning learning when the conditioned stimulus is repeatedly presented without the unconditioned stimulus. Next, spontaneous recovery. Re-emergence of the extinguished conditioned response, that is after a rest period. Next, generalization. Responding to stimuli that are similar to the original conditioning stimulus. Next, discrimination. The capacity to differentiate between the trained conditional stimulus and their non-reinforced similar stimuli. Next, operant conditioning, that is type 2 or instrumentational condition or trial conditioning and trial and error conditioning. It is formulated primarily by B.F. Skinner and Edward Thorndike. This is the law of effect. And operant conditioning involves learning and association between an animal's voluntary motor actions and its consequence, that is reward or punishment. Next, principle of reinforcement and punishment. First is operant responses are altered by 4 primary types of consequence. First is positive reinforcement, that is adding a favorable stimulus to increase behavior frequency. Example, rat pressing a lever to receive a food pellet. Next, negative reinforcement, that is removing an noxious or aversive stimulus to increases behavior frequency. That is example, pressing a lever to terminate an electrical shock. Next, positive punishment, adding an aversive stimulus to decrease behavior frequency. Example, a pecking bird receiving a mild electric shock. Next, negative punishment, removing a favorable stimulus to decrease behavior frequency. Example, withholding food reward when an unwanted action occurs. Next point, ethological and ecological significance about conditioning learning. First is foraging efficiency. Operant conditioning enables predator and herbivores to refine prey handling and patch selection over time. Next significance is predator avoidance, that is aversive classical conditioning, example Batesian mimicry, teaches predator to avoid brightly colored and toxic prey after a single non-lethal ingestion. Next is habitat selection. Animals learn to associate microhabitat features with shelter and food availability, which is optimizing energy expenditure. Next, temporal dynamics and classical conditioning. The timing between conditioned stimulus and unconditioned stimulus determines the rate and strength of acquisition. First is delayed condition. The conditioned stimulus is presented fast and continuous until the unconditioned stimulus is introduced. This is the most effective procedure for establishing a strong association. Next, trace conditioning. The conditioning stimulus starts and ends before the unconditioned stimulus is presented, and leaving a time gap, that is trace interval, and memory mechanism, that is hippocampal activation, are required to bridge the gap. Next, simultaneous conditioning. Conditioning stimulus and unconditioned stimulus begins and end at the exact time. So surprisingly weak, as the conditional stimulus lack predictive value for the animal. Next, backward conditioning. Unconditional stimulus is presented before the conditioned stimulus, typically ineffective for excitation, often resulting in inhibitory conditioning stimulus. Next, schedules for reinforcement, that is operant conditioning, that is in nature consequence rarely occur 1:1 ratio, that is B.F. Skinner identified 4 core partial reinforcement schedule that govern response rate and persistence to extinction. Biological constraints and evolutionary ethology. Conditioning is strictly constrained by an animal's evolutionary history and genetic blueprint. First is Gracia effect, that is conditioned taste aversion or Gracia and Coiling in 1996. Demonstrated, that is biological preparedness, rats were given sweet flavored water paired with either radiation or shock. Next, rat easily learned to associate taste with nausea but failed to associate taste with shock. Next, conversely, they easily associated audio-visual cue with shock but not with nausea. Next, learning is not equipotential. Animals are evolutionarily hardwired to associate specific stimuli that naturally co-occur in ecological niches. Next, latent inhibition. Prior exposure to a neutral stimulus without any reinforcement slows down the rate of subsequent conditioning when the stimulus is later paired with an unconditioned stimulus. It prevents animals from forming irrelevant association with familiar background stimuli. Neurobiological basis of conditioning. Conditioned learning causes physical alteration in brain circuits primarily involving synaptic plasticity. That is, first is Aplasia californica model, that is classical conditioning of the gill withdrawal reflex involves presynaptic facilitation of sensory neurons and increasing neurotransmitter is release glutamate release onto the motor neurons. Next, long-term potential or LTP. Persistent strengthening of the synapse based on the recent patterns of activity and operates primarily via NMDA and AMPA glutamate receptors in the hippocampus and amygdala. Next, dopaminergic reward pathways. Operant reinforcement relies heavily on the dopamine projection from the ventral tegmental area to the nucleic accumbens and signaling prediction error when rewards exceed the expectations. CSI NET GATE DBT-JRF highlighted topic, that is according to stimulation, sensitization greater than conditional stimulus greater than habituation greater than operant. And according to reverse stimulus, this behavior is reverse, that is habituation greater than operant conditioning learning greater than conditional learning greater than sensitization learning. Now the topic has ended. For all video, please subscribe my YouTube channel Biogenesis by Madhurima and follow my Facebook account Madhurima Datta. Thank you everyone.